Tomiyama. Dr. Tomiyama is a world leader in the area of obesity and weight stigma as a social psychologist. She, this is all from memory. She got her undergraduate at Cornell and then her PhD from UCLA. We were so fortunate for her to come to UCSF. I was so fortunate for her to come to UCSF because she definitely helped me with my application to the RWJ Health and Society Scholarship Program. And so she's one cohort ahead of me. And then from there, she got a position as an assistant professor at Rutgers.
In the Department of Nutrition.
Is that right?
Jointly with psychology. Is Carol, are you able to hear?
And then was recruited away back to UCLA, where she has been is now a professor in the Department of Psychology in the health psychology area, and has done incredible things in a variety of different research domains. And I actually think is one of the fiercest, most creative psychological scientists that I know.
Woo! So, yes, I'll second that. Absolutely. She has I'm tagging on to you.
Yeah, tag on.
She has a string of awards following her from early career. She is now the president of the American Psychological Association. She's also been leading DEI efforts in every society. We pulled her, because she did such a great job in APS, we pulled her into APMR, so now she's on that DEI committee and brings so much kind of wisdom and good judgment. And I would agree with Eric about the creativity. And the last thing I'll say is the string of proteges. You put so much care into training your students, and you already have so many wonderful, successful students that I've gotten the pleasure to work with some of them on NGHS studies. So that's been the triple bonus. So we've got many of our postdocs here, and we have our guests, our colleagues on Zoom. You can introduce yourself to Janet in the chat. Seems like you know Carol, Janet.
Just because Carol said in the chat, can you make the audio a little louder, please? But I do know Carolyn Ponting, and I know Dolce, one of my former undergraduate students. So cool to see you here.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say hi. I literally 30 minutes ago, I was walking to the elevator and your face popped up with your seminar for today. And I made space in my calendar to be here because you just made such a huge impact on my undergrad experience. And I had the pleasure of being in Dr. T's health psychology lab 151. I'll never forget. And so yeah, I'm truly here at UCSF today because of you. And so I just wanted to be here to hear you once again because you were just such an amazing professor.
Thank you. I'm gonna write that down and favor that. Okay, and hi. And hi, Rachel. Hello, all the people that I know, and I'm happy to meet those of you who I don't know yet. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay, so you see my title slide there, hopefully. Great. Okay, so I really wanted to talk to you all about my weight stigma work today because it all started at UCSF during my postdoc. So I thought it would be nice to give you kind of a historical overview of how this research has developed across kind of the past decade or more even, and kind of pay homage to the people, students and mentors that I've had along the way. Before I start, I should say I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And I also want to give just a note on terminology. So, this is evolving, but I do feel like there are some people for whom obesity, that word itself, is triggering because it indicates sort of an othering or some sort of pathological state. And so I just wanted to give a short content warning. I am going to use the word obesity in parts of this presentation. And when I do so, I'm really referring to it as a body mass index of 30 and above. I'm not using it as a judgment of any kind or even saying that it is a medical condition. And I'm happy to have that discussion at the very end as well, if you'd like. Okay, So today, I hope by the end of the seminar that you will you will be able to describe the scope and nature of weight stigma and weight bias, and how it can actually ironically promote weight gain and ultimately poor metabolic health. And, we health psychologists like to use the biopsychosocial model, and that's really the name of the game here, is how do we integrate psychological and biological factors as they relate to weight stigma and stress. And so just to set the stage, many of you probably know that weight stigma is highly prevalent. So, if you go to any newsstand, you'll see magazine covers like this. This is from 2021. It's not even from that long ago, talking about the best and worst beach bodies. And the assumption here is that the larger bodies are the worst ones. And so these are the kinds of things that, we're inundated with in society. But it's not just, societal sensationalist people who kind of adopt a weight stigmatizing stance. It's also people in academia. So this is Jeff Miller. He's a professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico, who said, "Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation." #truth. And so it's rampant in academia, even medical ethicists. So this is Daniel Callahan. He leads a medical ethics think tank, and he really argues that we should be using weight stigma as a way to motivate people to lose weight. And he even went so far as to publish this piece in JAMA Pediatrics, which is, leading pediatrics journal, saying that we should be using stigma light. Like, children need to understand that it's not okay to have obesity. And so, I was thinking about this as a civilian. I didn't think that sounded right. Public policy based on making people feel bad doesn't strike me as like the best way to go about things. But I am a scientist. So it was my job at that point to say, is it true? Is it true that stigmatizing individuals will lead to weight loss and heightened motivation? Or could it be sort of a rebounding effect or backfiring and make people actually eat more and maybe gain weight? So that's what I've been spending the last 10 years doing, with a little bit of intervention at the end that I hope to get to. So as I was thinking about this, so I was trained at UCLA, as Eric and Alyssa mentioned, and here, just as with at UCSF, really strong on stress research. And this paper by Dickerson and Kemeny, a meta-analysis published in 2004, was kind of like a foundational paper that we all kind of were in awe of Sally for publishing. And what this meta-analysis showed is that the many different stressors out there, those are different kinds of stressors on the x-axis. The ones that have kind of the biggest impact in terms of our body's physiological responding via the hormone cortisol, it's really those stressors that are A, social, and B, evaluative. So stressors that are social in nature and that stressors that involve judgment. Those are the ones that seem to elicit the greatest cortisol response. So I was thinking about this, and I knew that weight stigma is definitely social. Weight stigma is definitely evaluative. It involves judgment. And then I was thinking, on the other hand, of work by Alyssa Epel and others, that, well, we know that cortisol does a lot of things in the body, but some of the things that it's responsible for doing, signaling the body to store excess energy as fat, particularly in the visceral or abdominal region. There's neuroscience work showing that cortisol really potentiates reward pathways in the brain. So it makes that high calorie, high sugar food taste really good. And we know from placebo-controlled randomized administration studies that if you give people cortisol, their eating drive goes up. So I was trying to put all this information together in my head and kind of swirling around a theoretical model, which I ultimately published in 2014, called the cyclic obesity weight-based stigma model, where individuals encounter weight-based stigma And that triggers a stress response, resulting in increased cortisol and then increased eating through the processes I just told you about, which ultimately over time would lead to weight gain. And then if you weigh more, then you're at even greater risk for experiencing obesity or weight-based stigma. So that's why I named it the acronym being the cobwebs model, to really make the point that people get stuck in the cobwebs. It's a vicious cycle that people get stuck in. And so what I'm going to do is briefly summarize kind of everything I've done to gather evidence for the cobwebs model and like do it kind of historically the way that it developed. So the first step was really just a proof of concept, like, is there any relationship between weight stigma and cortisol levels? And this was done, of course, with Alyssa and also former postdoc named Jennifer Dobbin-Meyer. This was data drawn from her case study, I think. And so again, we're just trying to see, is there any correlation between weight stigma and cortisol? And so that's the hypothesis. This was a small sample of 42 women with a body mass index in the overweight or obesity range. I wish I could tell you there's like the questionnaire that measures weight stigma, and I'm working on that with a team of people, but at the time, there wasn't kind of that gold standard self-report measure. So we used two different ones. One called the Stigmatizing Situations Inventory was really focused on objective events that happen to you, like losing a job because of your size. But of course, as health psychologists, we care about the psychology aspect of it. And so we also measured the modified stigma consciousness scale. So how conscious are you of the weight stigma that's out there? How much are you buying in? Those of you who are stress researchers also know, like, there's no way to take like one saliva sample and say, that's your cortisol level. Cortisol is a somewhat annoying hormone that I'll talk about on the next slide. Actually, let me just go there now. Cortisol follows this diurnal pattern where you wake up and it's pretty high and it peaks about 30 minutes after you wake up and then gradually decreases throughout the day until it starts rising again while you're asleep. And so what you have to do to measure cortisol is take many, many samples throughout the day, and then you could calculate an area under the curve and look at total daily cortisol output. You know, how much cortisol are your tissues swimming in? Or you could measure this 30-minute awakening response. How much does your cortisol spike in the morning? I will say psychosocial factors seem to relate to the awakening response the most. So if you're short on budget and you can only do 2 samples, that might be where I put my money. I'm curious to think what others think. And then you could also look at cortisol slope. So how steeply does your cortisol come down throughout the day? You want a nice steep slope. You don't want to be high all day long and have this really flat high slope. So we looked at all of those things. We also looked at, this was kind of the brass ring. I was so interested in aging. Of course, that was one of the things that brought me to Alyssa's lab. We also had a measure of oxidative stress, which many of you in the audience are super aware of what that is, measured via F2 isoprostanes. You can think of it as a cumulative measure of wear and tear at the cellular level. So we think of it as one of many aging markers. With all that said, what we found is that, the objective events and the stigma consciousness were significantly related to a bigger cortisol awakening response, that 30-minute bump after waking up. How much cortisol you're waking up with, that's morning cortisol. And this is kind of incredible to me. We did see a relationship where more weight stigma, more oxidative stress. And so something I want to mention, and I will return to over and over, is that this analysis controls for BMI, meaning it's not just that heavier people have more cortisol and heavier people experience more weight stigma. It's regardless of what you actually weigh, you still see these relationships. So I'm trying to show that to you in a graphic form here. On the x-axis is weight stigma. On the y-axis is total cortisol, but any of the things you could put on the y-axis, it looks exactly the same. the red open circles and the red line, those are like the thinnest people, thinnest body mass index, lowest body mass index in our sample. The green is the upper 75% body mass index in our sample. Those lines are virtually identical, meaning it's not about your actual BMI, but rather kind of how you're perceiving your psychological experience of weight stigma, which is really interesting to me and exciting to me as a psychologist. And so in that study, we found, yes, stigma is correlated with cortisol, but correlation is not causation. And so in order to detect causation, we had to do a randomized controlled experiment, of course, where we are now going to randomly assign people to experience weight stigma or not and look at their cortisol levels. And so this is a study done by 2 former students, Mary Himmelstein, who's now an assistant professor at Kent State, and Angela Rodriguez, she's now at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And now we're changing from a correlational hypothesis to a causal one. Experiencing weight stigma is going to cause increases in cortisol levels. This study was done in women, and you might recall, like, it's something about the psychological experience of weight stigma. So we made this into a quasi-experimental study. We recruited women who perceive themselves as heavy and women who perceive themselves as thin. And I don't think I have to tell many of you that many of the women who perceive themselves as heavy were actually not based on body mass index standards. So there's, a lot of body dysmorphia out there. And we randomized them to either experience weight stigma or control. So let me walk you through this study as if you are a participant. You've signed up for a study that's called The Psychology of Shopping. It sounds really fun. Unfortunately, not a very fun study to be in. We can talk about ethics and debriefing later if you'd like as well. So you come into our suite of lab rooms. There's a door that's like halfway open and they're closed like this that you can see through the crack in the door. There's pop music blaring from the room. It sounds like there's some fun shopping activity going on. And we said, oh, we're really interested in the hormonal effects of shopping in groups. So, we're really lucky. We had this up and coming UCLA alumna donate the clothes, but we just need to make sure that you're going to fit into the clothes before you start shopping with everyone. So we took them into another room and we weighed them. And then we brought them into a waiting room with a very small couch. And sitting on the couch was a very thin Confederate. So a Confederate is someone who is actually working with the study. They're just an actor, but the participant doesn't know that. They think it's a true, real participant. And so we beckon to the Confederate and we say, great news, you've qualified for the shopping part. You can go in and start shopping with everyone. And then for those in the weight stigma condition, we said, unfortunately, your shape and size just aren't ideal for this style of clothing, and we really do want everyone to have fun and feel good. Plus, we want to return the clothing to the designer in good condition. So at this point, if I were in the room with you, many of you would be like gasping and whispering to one another. But often after these talks, people come up to me, often those in larger bodies, and they say, this is my everyday. This is what I deal with every time I go shopping. And so we were really trying to find an ecologically valid, realistic manipulation. And I'll show you some data in a little bit that indicates maybe we hit the mark there. Okay, so the control condition was also rejected, but just not because of their weight. We said, you were the last to sign up. You can't shop with everyone because the study's full. And then we collected cortisol before stigmatization and then 30 minutes after. That's because cortisol takes 30 minutes to hit your saliva after a stressor has occurred. Okay, so that was a lot of methods. So let me remind you of the hypothesis that experiencing weight stigma is going to cause increases in cortisol, but especially for people who think they're heavy. You have to kind of identify as part of the group in order for you to experience weight stigma. And that's exactly what we found. I'm here just showing you the heavy perceived weight, folks. On the y-axis is cortisol, and on the x-axis, left side control group, right side stigma group. The key thing is for those people who saw themselves as heavy, the key bars to look at are the time 2 bars. The difference between the control group and stigma group is significant, meaning that stigmatized women had higher cortisol after stigmatization compared to the control group. So that indicates that stigma causes cortisol secretion. Those of you who've been following along carefully will be like, well, you haven't really talked about eating yet. So I'll just quickly talk about a study where we did look at weight stigma and eating. This was done with Courtney, who's now at Google, and Angela again. And in this study, we tried to randomly assign the experience of weight stigma by randomly assigning people into different body sizes. How do you do that? That sounds impossible. Well, we did it through the use of these fat bodysuits. Here's Gloria, our research assistant. So we had like a very elaborate cover story. I don't have time to go into it for like why people had to wear these suits. But suffice to say, we randomly assigned people to either put on this bodysuit or not, but they still put on these weird clothes. So any effect isn't because of the ugly nature of these clothes. And we had people walk from the psychology building to Kirchhoff Hall and then back under, again, a really wacky cover story. And this was to expose individuals to the eyes of others. This area is always teeming with students. And so we knew that if they walked over here and walked back, that they would experience being seen by people. And we measured these different psychological and behavioral outcome measures, anger, depression, anxiety, things like that. But also anti-fat attitudes I put here in italics because we were hoping, so some of you who are older might remember the Tyra Banks special where she put on a fat suit and went out into public and people were horrible to her. And for her, it was like a real wake-up moment of, wow, I have empathy now for higher BMI individuals because of the treatment they get. So we were hoping like this might serve as even like an empathy intervention and make people's anti-fat attitudes lower. And then of course, we're trying to test the cobwebs model. So we had people eat M&Ms, potato chips, and full sugar Coke consumption. And I'm going to highlight in red the things that were higher in the fat suit group versus the control group. So yes, they had more of these negative emotions, but anti-fat attitudes were no different. In fact, the means were slightly in the opposite direction where the fat suit group had higher anti-fat attitudes, which is really interesting. And I would love any ideas you have on this. But they also had greater M&M, potato chip, and Coca-Cola consumption. It was actually a 191 calorie difference, almost 200 calories difference. So if you're seeing these kinds of effects every single time a person is experiencing weight stigma, you could see how that could over time lead to weight gain. So let me.
So interesting. Janet, can I tell you a finding I had?
Yeah.
That's similar. We exposed undergraduate women to all these pictures of models and as skinny as they could be, just like the most, bodies that we thought would lead them to a social comparison that they would feel lower self-esteem, and their self-esteem like went up so much. They were all normal, so they were heavier than the pictures, but it was like the opposite effect. Like there was a psychological reactance to it.
Wow, that's unexpected, but maybe expected kind of the opposite of these findings.
Well, but your women were like experiencing, well, anyway, I'll read the paper to see how,
Yeah, and is that finding published?
I did it when I was an undergrad with Kelly Brunell, and Denise Wilfley didn't believe my findings, and I never published them, and I absolutely should have because they were such big effects, but it was completely the opposite. And I think they were, I don't know, but I mean, they were kind of confident undergrads who might have been like, screw you.
Yeah.
Showing me all these ideal bodies. I don't care. I don't know.
I mean, it's super interesting given social media, and that's what people are looking at now. And so, there could be implications, or maybe moderators. If you're at Yale, you have high self-esteem, and as you were saying. Okay, so that study gave us causal data on eating, but all of these are like really weird lab-based manipulations. Is there any evidence that weight stigma would predict future weight gain? And so this is a study that I'll tell you about done with Jeff Hunger and of course the whole NGHS team, the NHLBI growth and health study that Alyssa and Barbara Larian, so many of you in the room have worked with. This is an amazing cohort of almost 2,400 girls, half of whom are Black, half of whom are white. And they were assessed once a year, every year, for 10 measurement points from age 10 to 19, and from 3 different sites. And we did a follow-up in the Richmond, California site. But today I'm just going to talk about this childhood data. And so luckily at age 10, there was a sort of weight stigma measure. Have any of these people told you you're too fat? Followed by this list of father, mother, sister, brother, best girlfriend, boy you like best, and teacher, because they're 10-year-olds. And what we found is that if you experience weight stigma, what we're calling weight labeling, then you had at age 10, you had a 66% greater likelihood of having obesity at age 19. And again, this controls for body mass index. So it's not just that heavy people end up heavier. Regardless of your starting out BMI, if you experience weight stigma, you're more likely to have obesity. For those of us who like to think more linearly, for every additional family member who stigmatized a girl in the NGHS study, her body mass index was 0.5 point higher at age 19. For non-family members, it was about 1/5 of a BMI point. And I think this is a really interesting but insidious aspect of weight stigma, which is that normally those who are closest to you are the sources of social support. So, if someone was racist to me, I could go to my mom and say, oh my gosh, can you believe this happened to me? And she would be supportive. In the case of weight, it kind of flips where we have now good evidence that those who are closest to us tend to be the most stigmatizing. So not only are they not the balm that eases the experience, but they can actually be perpetrators. So it's something that is really interesting and important to look at, I think. Okay, so it's 12:33. I'd like to show you a study. Okay, sorry, that study showed that stigma longitudinally predicts weight gain. But what we don't really have a grasp on is like the everyday phenomenology of weight stigma. So in the experiment, we tried to figure out what a weight stigmatizing experience might be that people experience, but we don't really know. And so for that, we needed to turn to ecological momentary assessment, where we follow people throughout their daily lives and see what's going on with them. And so I think the most efficient way to show you the methods of that study is to show you this video that we showed our actual participants. It's a training video.
Welcome to the Omniscience mobile system for patient engagement. This demo will show you how the OmniPro system will collect your responses via text message during the UCLA texting study. Once you start the study, you will text the keyword event to the number 87888 every time you experience weight stigma. That's when you're treated differently because of your weight, or something or someone makes you feel bad because of your weight. As soon as you text event, you will receive a message prompting you to give a saliva sample using the clear tube from the materials we've provided. After giving the saliva sample, reply with the letter Y to continue.
So something to note, we're not telling people, this is what weight stigma is, please check off the things that you experience. We're letting the participants define for themselves what they count as stigmatizing. Remember that cortisol takes 30 minutes to show up in saliva. So this saliva sample they're giving that you see on the screen is actually like a time machine where it's indexing 30 minutes ago what was happening with your cortisol levels. And that's going to actually be our baseline.
You will immediately receive a 3-question survey asking about your stress levels, feelings of shame, and the situation that initially prompted you to text event. Lots of events can count as stigmatizing. If it makes you feel bad, you should report it.
So you can see they gave us brief descriptions of what happened, and we've engaged in coding of those to see, like, oh, is it from your physician? Is it from your family member? Is it from a coworker? And we're working on analyses to relate those to different aspects of the dependent variables.
Upon completing the first survey, the final message notifies you that you will receive a follow-up survey in 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, you will receive a prompt to give a second saliva sample using the colored tube. You will then answer 4 more questions about hunger and food intake. "24.5 hours later, you will receive a final follow-up survey asking about food intake and stress levels. This will give us important information to help us understand your normal stress and eating patterns."
So that's the comparison point that you're going to see in the analyses. When they did versus when they didn't experience weight stigma, what happened to your eating and cortisol? Let me give you some preliminary findings here. So what did people report? Well, I went in the store to try on clothes and the salesperson told me they didn't have anything in my size. So this made us feel like, yes, we really nailed it with that Psych of Shopping study, that we did capture an ecologically valid type of weight stigma. I was at the gym playing ball and one of the other guys said, "I've got the fat guy." So this is important because weight stigma has really been thought of as a women's problem, that it's really about women in society that experience this. But this data and others show that actually men also experience weight stigma. I was at the doctor's office, and of course I was told I need to lose weight, as if I'm not trying. And I think weight stigma in the doctor's office is a really insidious place to see weight stigma, and that's why I'm going to show you an intervention that I'm trying in the healthcare setting to try and decrease providers' weight bias. Here are some preliminary results on eating. So after people were stigmatized, they were eating on average 3.21 servings of food versus the control time point 2.21. So exactly 1 more serving on average. And then what were they eating? Well, it's a Southern California sample, so a lot of Mexican food, nachos, Cheetos, nachos, burritos. Chips were actually the #1 food that people were eating. Flaming hot Cheetos was the actual #1. And then kind of your classic comfort foods, things like chocolate and ice cream and things like that. And so just in like the last 5 minutes or so, I thought I'd talk about some ongoing studies. So where is this all leading? I've made this huge deal out of how it's a cyclic model. It's a vicious cycle, but I haven't yet given anybody any evidence that it is cyclical. So this study funded by the National Science Foundation is designed to test that. So it's a 1-year study where we measure stigma, stress, cortisol, eating, weight, and then does that weight actually put you at increased risk of weight stigma? So really trying to test the whole cyclic model. Eric is a co-investigator on this R01 where we're manipulating weight stigma in the lab. So we are able to make causal inference here, but we're measuring different health behaviors outside of the lab. So they do kind of a traditional food buffet to measure their objective eating in the lab, but then they also fill out food diaries for the next 3 days. We put actographs on them to see their physical activity. Eli Petterman, also a former postdoc of Alyssa's, is another co-investigator. And then, of course, sleep actigraphy, which is where Eric comes in. And I think sleep and physical activity are really important variables that are totally missing from the cobwebs model. We do know how important those are for metabolic health and weight gain and stuff. So I'm excited to see the results of that. We're about 20 people away from our target N, Eric. And then, as I mentioned, weight stigma in healthcare can be really, really deleterious because we know that patients will avoid healthcare if they have a stigmatizing clinician, and that delays crucial diagnoses, and that can ultimately lead to really poor health outcomes. Or physicians who are really focused on weight can sometimes miss other crucial diagnoses. So Rebecca Hiles was a woman whose story went viral a couple years ago. She went to her physician complaining of shortness of breath. And the physician said, well, you need to lose weight, obviously, then you'll be able to breathe more. But what he had missed was an actual lung cancer diagnosis. And so this is why I've been spending a lot of my blood, sweat, and tears recently in intervening in the healthcare space. And I want to tell you just about one of them, which is with Kaiser Permanente. So that's one of the largest healthcare organizations in California, actually across the West Coast. And this was an intervention done at the West LA branch of Kaiser Permanente. And it involved a 4-hour continuing medical education formulated like a symposium where we gave didactic. I gave this talk basically to them to talk about the negative consequences of weight stigma. We had a actual Kaiser Permanente patient panel speak about their experiences with weight stigma in the clinic. We tried to change social norms by having these physicians sign a pledge to eradicate weight bias. And the most kind of astonishing thing is that the medical director of Kaiser Permanente made this a mandatory CME, meaning that we had, you know, not just the general practitioners, but also the surgeons. Kaiser Permanente just opened up a med school, so we had a lot of med students as well. And so what I'm going to show you in terms of very preliminary results is 2 different kinds of comparisons. Pre-intervention and post-intervention for the people who are in the intervention. And I'm also going to show you the intervention people compared to another Kaiser Permanente site that didn't undergo the intervention. It wasn't randomized, but that's the closest we could get in terms of matching. And so what is the, oops, sorry, I'm skipping over that. So, wow, this font is tiny. Sorry, I just slipped this in this morning. So on the left side, this is, the red is before the intervention, 12 months, and the orange is after the intervention. These outcomes on the x-axis are all confirmed via the electronic medical record. So this isn't an intervention study where we ask people like, oh, you know, what's your weight bias before and what's your weight bias after? But we're really interested in actual physician behaviors as a result. What were these outcomes? So I would love to talk about this with all of you. For Kaiser Permanente, to them, a win is more people diagnosed with obesity, more people given access to these evidence-based obesity treatment plans. So lifestyle, referral to bariatric medicine, and referral to bariatric surgery. And this was really born of their focus groups with patients, where a patient said, you know, I hate going to the doctor and having them say, well, did you try this diet or this exercise plan? Because I've been on every diet, I've been on every exercise plan. And when a physician was finally like, what you have is a diagnosable, continuing relapsing disease. And just like any other disease, we're going to treat it medically. So let me diagnose you and let me get you treatment. To them, that felt like stigma was really like lifting off of their shoulders. And so based on that, they wanted greater diagnosis of obesity and greater referral to these outcomes. And what you see pre-post is, yes, more people were diagnosed with obesity in the year leading up to the intervention versus the year following the intervention. Same thing with referral to lifestyle and bariatric medicine and bariatric surgery. If you compare our intervention group to a different Kaiser Permanente site, you're not seeing a difference in diagnosis of obesity. But you are seeing differences in these referral rates to these evidence-based treatments. And so anytime you're doing real world stuff like this, you want to worry about unintended consequences. So one unintended consequence I wanted to tell you about is the bariatric medicine clinic was so overwhelmed with referrals that they actually had to raise their BMI criterion in order to be referred. And so ironically, because of this intervention, it made it harder for people to get referred to bariatric medicine, which is something that I think is important to note. And the other thing that I think is really important to note is that for some people, diagnosis of obesity is like the most stigmatizing thing you could do to a person. And so this is from the viewpoint of people who, you know, have felt under siege by a medical profession their whole life by having these physicians pathologize their body size and basically say, we want to eradicate everyone who looks like you. And so I could see how that would feel really like an existential threat to somebody who does not want to be diagnosed with obesity. And so I think it's really interesting to think about when is diagnosis of obesity stigmatizing versus not. And I wanted to just end in the last 60 seconds and talk about this intervention I'm doing with UCLA Pediatrics, where they have the actual exact opposite goal, where they do not want their physicians to be diagnosing obesity. That is the ultimate outcome that they want. They want physicians to, instead of calling it a weight check, calling it a lifestyle check. So we're doing objective, we did a very similar intervention in pediatric residents, and we're doing chart coding to see. And we're also coding the charts to look for stigmatizing language, decreases in that, hopefully. And because the name of the game is ultimately improving patient care. Okay, so I think I will end there and just put up my contact information here. And just so excited to engage with this group and answer any questions. Thank you. So I saw that Yuban has a question in the chat. This is regarding the study of 10 to 19-year-olds, this one, I think. And the question for those of you in the room is, did you also control for any effects of relationship quality more broadly? I'm wondering if it's being stigmatized specifically or having poor relationship overall. I think that's a really astute hypothesis, Yuban. We do have family functioning variables in NGHS, as I recall. So that's something we could definitely look at. It's a compound we didn't account for here, unfortunately.
You have the FACES, the family cohesion scale, that probably has some items on support. Well, it's, yeah, it's about support.
Got it. Thank you.
Janet, I am completely overwhelmed and in awe with this program. How could I know like a fraction of what you do, but this is such a phenomenal programmatic model that you've fleshed out. And this last study, when you're, in Kaiser and actually affecting referrals, that is just like the most amazing example of theory-based application of, psychological bias in the workplace, better than anything I've seen, better than the racial equity work. So Nancy Adler would be like, her jaw would have dropped. And you even use like the electronic medical records, and like this would have been her favorite study of the year. Right? You've got the social psychology, the application, that right within the medical care system. And
thank you, Alyssa.
Yeah. So amazing how many patients you're helping with this.
Oh yeah, I didn't even say that statistic, but what is it? Yes. So they calculated out that 3,500 patients received access to treatments they otherwise may not have, which was a cool figure to see.
So one of the trends, Janet, and I think it'll take some time to think about all the psychological processes here, but there is a lack of stigma. Well, I'm going to just put out as a question, is there stigma around eating meat? My sense is there is a lack of stigma I mean, unless you're like living on a commune and everyone's a vegetarian and you're like the only meat eater, but there is an increasing database and, you know, I guess public awareness campaigns that are really wanting to push less meat or everyone realizes you can't say no meat. So it's kind of like, can we eat for the planet? So Eat Lancet came out in 2018 with a planetary diet. And now this whole global movement is working together to tie it to not just plant-based diet, but especially to meat and link it to sustainability issues and climate change, you know, particularly the global south obviously is hardest hit. So they're coming out in June with the new Eat Lancet report. And I guess my question is, I wonder, you know, it's going to basically be our biggest, you know, there's nothing controversial in the report. It's hugely solid. Our biggest push toward getting people to stop eating meat. And how can we use, you know, stigma, or should we not use stigma? There isn't stigma, you know, it's like, it's a really thorny problem.
Yeah, so you might know, but Daniel Rosenfeld, a grad student in my lab, like this is his whole jam is how do we get people to eat less meat? And in terms of like what I have studied, what we have studied, we try to look at like, is being stigmatized for becoming vegetarian a reason why people avoid going vegetarian? And that study found that it really did have nothing to do with it, sadly. It was more about they didn't expect vegetarian food to taste good or whatever. But I'm with you. We're not necessarily trying to make people into vegetarians. We also have a number of studies on flexitarians. These are people who want to reduce their meat intake. The other thing that brings to mind, maybe you've seen this study by Jenny J here at UCLA, where she taught a class on the environmental impacts of meat consumption and compared it to like a similar level class that just talked about the planet and the environment. And the group that got the class on planetary impacts of eating meat, their actual meat intake went down and their full diet CO2 levels projected went down as well. So I do think like there is a path to healthier eating, less meat through environmental motivations. But in our work, at least, what we're seeing is that the most adherent vegetarians are people who are animal rights motivated, followed by environment, and then followed by health is the least sort of adherent vegetarian. And so maybe there's something tying those two together, maybe animal rights. But then animal rights becomes interesting because if you want to save more lives, you should stop eating chicken. But if you want to save the planet, you should stop eating beef. And so there's like this tension even within the vegetarian groups in terms of their motivations and like what behavior that would indicate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There are more questions. We need to move on, but I'd love to talk to you more about this in our climate class that you know about. Jenny J is one of the faculty and Vicky Mays at UCLA. And we are having them do Jenny's sandwich calculator, carbon calculator this week. And I guess the idea is even if individual footprint doesn't matter, like kind of the alarm of seeing how much of a difference your diet makes, even a meat sandwich versus other, is a way to motivate people into climate action as a whole.
Yeah, that's cool. Of course you would be working with Jenny.
We'll see. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm like a big fan of hers and I didn't know about that study, so thank you.
Yeah.
But she's got a lecture. You guys will see it. We have 3 postdocs who are in the class, Dorothy and Katie and a few others. So they're going to do it this week. So we'll get firsthand.
Yay, that's great.
So we've got questions. We have Sarah and
Sarah.
Dolce.
Sarah was first.
Hey, I'm Sarah Forsberg. I'm a psychologist in the Eating Disorders program. Thank you so much for this talk. It's super incredible work, and we, super helpful in thinking about how we serve our population who experiences a lot of weight stigma. I guess I have two questions, but maybe for the broader group, I'm curious about the intervention with physicians and whether there were any specific barriers you're faced in implementation, like related to attitudes about the study, the project, maybe some of the ways you framed the intervention to kind of overcome some of those up front. And then broadly speaking, like how are you planning to scale this? Because I think clearly we need this across the healthcare system. So I'm really interested to hear about next steps.
Yes, well, we were so worried about physician pushback. So that's why the buy-in at the very, very top level was so key. And I can't take credit for that. It was my collaborator, Amanda Velasquez, who got that before she even approached me about this. We let in sort of Trojan horsed the whole thing about stigma by starting with very well-respected Kaiser Permanente physicians, as well as like Robert Kushner, who's like, like a god in obesity medicine, talking about here are some uncontrollable factors that determine body weight. And they talked about microbiome and, like all this other epigenetics. And then they did a little bit about structural things. And then basically the patient panel was super helpful because it wasn't just us wagging our fingers and saying, don't do this. They were seeing these patients really opening their hearts up and sharing their stories. So I think those were kind of the three key, like the top down, starting easy with super respected people, and then tugging at heartstrings, I'd say, with the patient panel. I do also want to mention, I want to get to Dolce's question, but the NGHS finding where the girls called too fat at age 10 having higher risk of obesity at age 19, they're also simultaneously at higher risk of disordered eating, cognitions, and behaviors, as you might imagine. So higher drive for thinness, more binge eating, symptomatology. So it's like this twin thing that happens with both disordered eating and obesity. Dolce.
Yeah, I was just curious, as a former ballerina, all of this just alarms in my, own personal experience and having been around that world. I'm just curious to know if anyone in your lab is interested or has looked at any of this and how it pertains to athletes, both men and women. Just as you mentioned, there is massive weight stigma among men, and it's, not talked about as much. I'm just curious to know if anyone in your lab is looking at that or interested in looking at in how this affects athletes.
Yeah, I'm also a former ballerina. So Sally Dickerson of that Dickerson and Kemeny, and of course, Wendy Mendez as well. Not currently in the lab, but going back to now my honors thesis at Cornell, I did look at differential disordered eating symptoms across different sports and found that team-based sports seem to be protective of disordered eating cognitions and behaviors, but solo sports, so things like diving, those tended to be more at risk. So even if it was like something in water, like comparing water polo to diving, like they're all wearing swimsuits, but it seemed to be about like a group versus this like solo competitor that seemed to make the difference. That I didn't publish either, but it's at least some grist for the mill, for future research.
Thank you.
Truly, there's lots of questions, but one more known question. Tessa, are you on still?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was just thinking about the study you mentioned where people kind of maybe increased weight bias after walking across the campus and thinking about maybe the effects of internalized bias and how that might play into it. I'm not sure if any of the other studies looked at that or what your thoughts are on the effect of that.
Yeah, so weight bias internalization is where you buy into these societal negative thoughts and apply them to yourself. I was really slow to the internalized weight bias game. Rebecca Pearl at Florida is really the leader in that. And like now I'm very much convinced, but at the time I didn't have the foresight. But I think that's a totally reasonable hypothesis that internalization would lead to negative attitudes towards others. I have one paper with Mary Himmelstein that shows that people who had the lowest body self-esteem or body satisfaction were the same people who are the most stigmatizing to others. And so that makes me think, Tessa, that you're spot on with your hypothesis. But here we had randomization. So the two groups should have the same level of internalized weight bias. So it's not going to explain the findings here, but I do think it's such an important part of this whole weight stigma picture.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
Do you know anything about like levels of obesity stigma or internalized bias in certain regions, like in the South? There are certain regions where it's like 80% overweight or obese.
Yeah, what a good question. I'm going to write that down. So I do have a study that is census matched to the United States, and we do have census region. And so I could look at rates of like, all we've done is like in the United States, 41% of people experience weight stigma, but to look at it by region would be really interesting.
Yeah, I imagine LA is pretty bad.
Yeah, I don't think we can get that fine-tuned with census region. I think they're bigger, but yes, I imagine it's bad in LA.
I think that's, I mean, I wish you were just here all the time.
Me too.
Me
Or start petitioning.
Petition in this room.
Dish lab.
Well, this talk has been very good for my self-esteem. Thank you, everybody, for all the nice things you're saying.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Janet.
Thank you, Janet. That was fantastic.
Great to see you all.
We'll hope to catch you in person next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.